A Participatory Economy, Robin Hahnel's new book on post-capitalism, is out now. Thomas Piketty describes it as a key contribution and a must-read. I talk with Robin Hahnel about the book in the first of a special 3-part episode next on Pep Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello and welcome to Pep Talk, the Participatory Economy podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepańczyk from Chicago. In this episode, we will discuss part of the book, A Participatory Economy by Robin Hahnel. And I'm going to be joined in this episode by the author of the book, Robin Hahnel, who is joining us from Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. Robin, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Whenever I've in past lives, when I've hosted radio programs and I've had on folks who have written books, I tend to always start off my interviews about the books that they've written with the same question, which I'm going to pose to you now. What is the book about and why did you write it?
The book is about a coherent alternative to capitalism, one that learns from the lessons of the failures of centrally planned socialism in the 20th century, and one that outlines a perfectly feasible way that we could run modern economies that would actually achieve the goals that I think anyone would ask a desirable economy to achieve. And it's quite explicitly, a proposal that is beyond anything you could call social democratic or liberal capitalism. Not that liberal or social democratic capitalism might not be something that we have to fight for in the here and now. But we basically look at that and say, but we can tell that that's going to fall short. And we can tell that even if you achieve social democratic capitalism, you're leaving in place forces that could take you backwards. Why not seriously consider whether or not we could design an economy that would, achieve these goals that I think that most people would agree on. So that was the purpose of writing the book. You mentioned before that, I had recently published a book called Democratic Economic Planning. And
we're showing on the screen now.
That's right. And I think I did mention to people, I thought it might be my last book. And then all of a sudden now there's another book that's come out. So what's the reason for the second book? And the answer is very, very simple. The first book was primarily written for economists, or at least people who have considerable economic training. And the reason for that was that economists are skeptical that, any economy that is not a market system, a capitalist system, a system with central planners, they're skeptical that any such thing is possible. And, and they require that one answer them in the terms that they understand. So that's a book that contains proofs of mathematical proofs of theorems about convergences of planning procedures. And that discusses in detail why it is that central planning was inevitably going to disappoint. But the audience for that book, therefore, is very limited. I mean, the percentage of economists who are even interested in discussing an alternative to capitalism is a very small group. And yet there's an increasingly large group of people out there in the United States and in Europe, particularly young people, and people in organizations like, Democratic Socialists of America, whose membership has absolutely flourished and blossomed over the past 5 or 6 years. People who have become convinced that socialism isn't a dirty word because Bernie Sanders has managed to convince people that it's not. And that you can be a sensible, good person with great ideas and call yourself a socialist. But most of those people they're not economists. They don't have the kind of training that economists have. And therefore, the Democratic Economic Planning book was a stretch for that much, much larger audience. So the whole purpose of writing A Participatory Economy was to take the meat out of, to get rid of the technical parts that were inaccessible and take the meat conclusions, out and present that to an audience that, it helps if you've had an introduction to economic course at some point in your life, but it's not something you have to have had in order to comprehend it.
Just to quote briefly from the book, because you had mentioned that you said it was going to be your last book. In fact, in page 14 of the preface, for the main author, this will be the last book he writes on the intellectual subject that he has consumed more of his time and energy than any other for the last 50 years.
Well, that was true about that book, that I've been thinking, writing, and publishing about a coherent alternative to capitalism and centrally planned socialism. Something that in Europe would be called a libertarian socialist economy. Now that's a phrase that in the United States can be very, very confusing, but in European audiences, they would understand what that is. So in that sense, I really did think of it as the culmination of 50 years of work, putting all in one place, everything that I could come up with and provide for others to sort of food for thought for others. But it's a tough read, as you know.
I helped write it.
In a participatory economy, is a much easier read.
Yes.
For an ordinary audience.
Yeah. Let's get into more of the book now. So the book is divided into 9 broad chapters, as well as an introduction and conclusion. A lot of the topics that are raised there have been brought up before on Pep Talk, this podcast, in previous episodes, which we encourage people to check out if you haven't already done so. With regards to chapter 1, clarifying goals, this is basically a lot of the books that you and others have written about the model of an economy known as a participatory economy. They're starting out this way, like you started actually in democratic economic planning, and that others have done in other books about that economy. You're starting out with what seems to be the basics, the measuring stick, the yardstick, the basis by which we judge economies, because we need to have some fair way to be able to judge economies. This strikes me as kind of obvious, but my question to you is, why don't other economies do something like this? Or why don't other economists do this? Or do they?
I think they mostly don't. I think we are an outlier, and we've been an outlier now for going on 40 or more years, in terms of embracing a methodology that I consider to be sort of obviously straightforward, which is, before we even start to talk about different economic institutions, markets, central planning, some different version of planning, participatory planning, private enterprise, public enterprise. Before we even talk about institutions and procedures for coming to, the procedures we're recommending for making certain choices that have to be made in any economy, well, why wouldn't you want to first say, well, what are we trying to achieve here? We've always thought that this is sort of an honest and straightforward way to approach things, and we've always done that. And you're right that when most people write about all, different economic systems or why they like this or they like that, they really don't, start with their goals and then argue that some particular procedure achieves the goal. They simply start talking about procedures and the pluses and minuses of one procedure or another. So I think I still, to this day, I think that's one of the things that I'm proud of and that I would not change, that we go ahead and start with our goals. The other reason is that sometimes people talk about their goals and they say, well, we want economic democracy, and we want economic justice, and we want environmental sustainability. But how you define what that goal really is becomes very, very important. And being vague about what some of these things mean, I think has given it's created a tremendous amount of confusion, vagueness about what goals are. So we tried not only to say what are our goals, but to be very, very concrete in how we have defined those goals, because in my view, depending on how you define these goals, the institutions that would achieve them would be quite different. And therefore, we think a lot of what's really at dispute is being very clear about what you want your economy to achieve. And so that's why we've always approached things that way. And that's why the first chapter basically just goes through the goals, one after another, and says, now this is what we mean by that goal. And this is how that might be different from what some other people mean when they use the same words.
Why don't you think that this is more popular, this approach that is? I mean, you would figure this strikes, you've mentioned it's kind of, glaringly obvious. You do it, others have done it, but it's not, you say it's not widely done. Why not? Or why don't you think so?
Well, here is a very distinct possibility that if you laid out the goals clearly and made an argument for why it is that these are the goals we should want our economy to achieve, what you would very quickly discover is that all the major kinds of economies that other people have argued for, believe in, and want to promote come up short. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you define your goals clearly and make a compelling argument for those goals, I think the results can be very embarrassing in terms of what they say about capitalism, certainly neoliberal capitalism, what they say about even social democratic capitalism, what they say about authoritarian centrally planned socialism. So, I mean, if you want to defend any of these other economic systems, I think a clear definition of goals and defense of goals can lead to great embarrassment. So I always suspect that may be a reason that people have avoided approaching things that way.
To your knowledge, do you know if anyone has kind of done a grand comparison of various economies using this framework? I'm going to compare a market economy, a command planning economy, and any other kind of economy or economies. And I'm going to put them through the ringer and have them, score them with these metrics. Anyone ever done that to your knowledge?
I'm now retired from full-time teaching.
So no.
But for 35 years, I taught a class that was called Comparative Economic Systems.
Okay.
First at American University, and then later out here in Oregon at a couple of universities I've taught at in the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. And whenever I taught comparative economic systems, this is how I taught it. I said, let's first have a discussion about what the goals of any economy are, and then let's look at all the different kinds of economic systems there are. We can start with feudalism, we can do neoliberal capitalism, we can do social democratic capitalism, we can do market socialism, we can do, centrally planned systems, we can do a participatory economy, and we can look at all these different systems, which are different rules and procedures for making economic decisions. And we can look at them from the perspective of how well they do or don't achieve these various goals. So that was the way I always taught that class for 40 years.
Where can we find the syllabus?
It's true. Well, sometimes institutions still have old syllabuses on websites. Also, the Union of Radical Political Economics is always they ask members to send in syllabi, and they sort of make those syllabi available of course offerings of people who are members of the Union of Radical Political Economics. And I think I probably sent in my syllabus at some point or another. But that website, the Union of Political Economy website, is actually a very interesting website for syllabi by radical economics professors that they offer at various universities where they teach.
For reference of listeners and viewers, the website is URPE, URPE, for the Union of Radical Political Economics.org. Here's a dumb question. Do you pronounce it economics or economics?
I pronounce it economics.
Is this a bone of contention among economists or economists?
Well,
or do you just not care?
Well, most people pronounce my name Hahnel, but since it's my name, I say, but those of us who have that last name, we actually pronounce it Hahnel. There's a controversy that I have amongst people. I don't happen to know Paul Krugman or Krugman personally, so I've never been able to ask him how to pronounce his name. But I assume that he would prefer to have it one way or the other, and I think we ought to just go along with that.
Having studied linguistics, this is a big thing with me. The priority regarding one's pronunciation is you ask them, and
right.
You go with that.
Ask whoever it is, the authoritative. Yeah. There should be somebody who gets to decide.
Yeah, and that authority is the person who has the name or who takes the name. They should. It's like they're the authority. They make a decision. Maybe they may not care. And that's fine. They just at least make that clear.
Although we don't, we don't actually, I don't know who the authority is that gets to decide whether we call it economics or economics, but I've always called it economics.
That goes into matters regarding authority in language. That's another podcast episode, but and kind of running far afield from economics. That's how it's to be pronounced. But anyway, back to the book at hand. So A Participatory Economy, part 1 talks about the goals, and you outline the goals. We talked about them in previous episodes. Part 2 talks about, the kind of the point regarding the whole book, what's called building castles in the sky, a kind of, an intentionally derogatory term by fairly left activists who think that trying to craft out models before you've won the revolution is just a waste of time. But you and I think, have been along the lines of it's as the least big waste of time of any activity that an activist can do, I think. It's like, that's what you should be doing, trying to figure that out. Why do you think there's been this adamant opposition mostly from the left? Because people not adhering to this it's been mostly people on the left side of the political spectrum who just don't even care because they already got the system they like, I guess, or just not bothered to have to worry about it. But it's people on the left for whom this is just a received dogma that you simply do not question, that you just don't talk about this. Why is this so controversial in your opinion?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that people who sort of come to discussions about an alternative to capitalism for the first time, sort of freshly, they assume that you're going to tell them what your alternative is and that you're going to be, as specific as you can about it. And on the other hand, you're absolutely right. The actual phrase building castles in the air was taken from the dissenting introduction to an issue of a left journal called Science and Society. And in 1991, the editor wanted to publish a special issue that was talking about alternatives, different models of alternatives to capitalism. And a very large percentage of his editorial board was adamantly opposed and didn't want to publish an issue, on that subject. And they wrote a dissenting opinion in the beginning of the issue. And they said, this is not the time to be building castles in the air. And this is 1990, 1991. I think that's been an unfortunate position that many on the left have taken. Sometimes what they argue is that, if you spell something out, then you're dictating to the people who make a revolution what they have to do. And I just think that's not, it depends on what the spirit is in which you're offering your model. I suppose I could be writing and saying, this is how it has to be done. And anybody who, overthrows capitalism and does something different, they need to be expelled from power. But I mean, that's not the sense in which any of us who are doing this are doing it. We're saying it's important to think things through as well as you can in advance, so that those who have an opportunity to replace capitalism with something different will have sort of a full body of thought that they can rely on in terms of making their choices about how to go about it. I think the other thing was that, there was a sense amongst leftists in 1990 that, well, obviously what was called socialism had failed. And I think they realized that there was not, unanimity amongst anti-capitalists about what we would propose. So it was sort of an embarrassing subject to bring up. But in any case, and there are others who simply think keeping things more vague is sort of a better way to proceed. There's others who would argue that we have so many other urgent tasks: preventing disastrous climate change before it's too late, addressing the most rapid rise in income and wealth inequality in advanced economies in the history of capitalism, in the history of the entire world, over the past 50 years, addressing, extreme rate, addressing, the kind of problems that Trumpism and sort of, and 21st century fascism on the rise, that all of these things are such urgent priorities that we just don't have time to think about this. We don't have time to squabble about it. And I don't want to argue that these other things aren't urgent tasks. I just think there's time and place for this also. And in particular, since 20th century attempts to build desirable alternatives to capitalism came up as short and badly as they did, that any sensible person is going to want to know, what are you proposing that's different from what some countries did in the 20th century? Or are you just proposing that somehow we can do that again and do it a little bit better? Mm-hmm. I think some of the people on the left, basically that's their position. They would say, I really want to do something pretty much like what they were trying to do in the Soviet Union, or they were trying to do in Yugoslavia. That was a different approach, by the way. But we want to avoid some mistakes they made. And there's other people who argue that, the thing that was wrong with socialism in the 20th century was it was attacked and it was undermined, by global capitalism that did everything they could to destroy those economies, those societies, and those political movements. And that's certainly true. I mean, it's certainly true that there was a tremendous, the international global environment in which attempts to build socialism in the 20th century took place was certainly not favorable, but very, very hostile. So you could reasonably say the idea wasn't bad, but we just have to overcome the kind of opposition. I don't think any of that washes. I think there were fundamental problems with what it was socialists were trying to do in the 20th century, and that we need to be very clear about what we want to do differently. And unless we are clear and make that clear to young people who are asking about capitalism, I don't like it, but what have you got? I don't think we have a very compelling story to tell them.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, you, for the last 30, 50 years or so, have been working on building your own kind of castle in the sky, and have been writing about it and advocating for it. And right now we're recording an episode where we're talking about a book about it on a podcast. Chapter 3 kind of goes into the next part about that, where you explain the kind of castle in the sky that you and Michael Albert, the co-inventor of Participatory Economy, helped build, where you list out the major institutions. We've talked about those institutions in the past. You can go to the website for the Participatory Economy website, where you can check them out. You can also see them outlined in the book in Chapter 3. What I wanted to ask you about this was tell us, please, a bit about your take regarding how did that come about? What was the process that you and Michael Albert did in actually building your castle in the sky? We've talked before about how you and he had talked painting in summers in Massachusetts, where you are now, in fact, where you discuss that out. But I mean, did you kind of do what has been outlined here, where you said, okay, we need our goals, so you figure out your goals. Okay, now we need the rules about that, so you work that out, and then you see, well, okay, I've got a rule. Does it match with these? Yes, no. If it not, you get rid of it. Tell us more about the process of how what's now a participatory economy came about.
What you just described is literally what we did. We were both working in the anti-war movement in the Boston area at the time.
This would have been like in the early 1970s.
That's right.
Okay.
This is 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972.
Okay.
And there was a very, very active anti-war movement in the Boston area. Michael Albert was the president of the student body at MIT and founder of the Rosa Luxemburg SDS chapter at MIT. So imagine that somebody in a left radical organization actually becomes elected president of the student body of an institution as apolitical as MIT. It was a rather amazing thing.
Yeah, I would not count MIT as an apolitical thing. They've got a lot of money and contracts with military and other things, I see your point.
It wasn't known and still isn't known for political activism amongst the student body.
That's fair.
In terms of where their interests lie. And during those years, there were time periods where we were working on anti-war organizing. I was also living in Lynn, Massachusetts, and working in a revolutionary youth movement organizing collective in a working class suburb of Boston. And we had to make a living, and at various points we were painting houses to make a living. So we found ourselves on scaffolding outside houses with nothing to talk about except what we wanted to talk about. And we literally did. Our process was, well, what are the goals we're trying to achieve in a desirable economy? So we talked a lot about that. And then we took a look at various institutions and procedures and tried to figure out what they would look like and why they would be best suited to achieving those goals. So that is literally what we did, and that was the origins of the model. And we published early versions as articles and as chapters in some books. Now there's one thing, there were some major areas that we really never addressed for a long, long period of time. And one of the things that this book does, and the Democratic Economic Planning book does, it addresses some major areas that have been unaddressed previously. And I'll just briefly mention what those are, because the model, the basic model in chapter 3 is the one that we have developed, many years ago, and we've defended against various criticisms over the years. But that basic model is really a proposal for workers' councils and how they're managed, neighborhood consumer councils and how they're managed, how it is that these neighborhood consumer councils and worker councils participate in an annual planning procedure designed to achieve the goals of economic efficiency, economic self-management, et cetera, et cetera. We had written a lot about income distribution, what is a fair system of income distribution and how can that best be achieved? But we had not addressed a whole host of issues. In particular, we never really addressed investment planning. And investment planning faces a whole host of issues that annual planning doesn't. And we had never addressed any kind of long-term development planning. Certainly, we had not addressed environmental planning, long-term environmental planning. We had not addressed long-term international economic planning. We had not addressed sort of education planning, long-term education planning. And so those things are things that now we have done relatively recently, and they are contained, in a participatory economy in various chapters. We had also not addressed, I'll tell this story on myself. For years, I would go around and give talks about a participatory economy. And inevitably from the audience, there would be, usually these are universities, and it would be a young female student who would ask the question. They'd say, well, I've listened to everything you said, and it all sounds pretty interesting, but you haven't talked about a single thing I care about yet. And I said, well, and what would that be? And what it was you can call it reproductive economic activity. Or kinship activity. I mean, there's various names for it. But
yeah, in democratic economic planning, we refer to it as caring labor.
Right. So we had never addressed a host of issues, that's at the centerpiece of what feminists and socialist feminists and Marxist feminists have been talking about now for decades. And my answer to that usually got me booed off the platform. I said, well, we're two males. Why do you want us to do that? I'm not sure we trust ourselves. And people said that's just basically a lame excuse. So finally, working with some women economists, socialist feminist economists, we finally sort of addressed that missing piece. And I do believe that if people take an honest look, I have a tremendous respect for the socialist feminist literature in terms of its critique of all the various ways that modern capitalist economies and non-capitalist economies historically, how they have disadvantaged women, in various ways. Most of the literature is basically elaborating that critique. It's explaining how it is that everything we've been doing wrong, and why it's been wrong, and why it's unnecessary. But there's very, very little that has come out of, I read those journals, and we actually sent this chapter, to a journal, a Journal of Feminist Economics, and said, here is a tentative proposal for how to organize this in a way that hopefully would not be subject to the criticisms that socialist feminists have elaborated so successfully. So if you don't like what's happening, I've always been of the conviction, if you don't like the way something's done, first be really clear about why you don't like it. But then wouldn't you want to think about what would you want instead? And so this is also the first time that, we've gone ahead and put out there. And here I'd like to say, in all these areas, investment planning, development planning, caring labor, we're making these proposals at this point in time, I would say, in a much more tentative way. Those proposals have not been vetted by 20 or 30 years of criticism, evaluation, discussion and debate. But what I'm hoping is, and I think this is an important role that somebody needs to play, you need to put some ideas out there about how to do these things in a way that seems to be good, in order to have them discussed and debated. So that when people get the chance and the opportunity to replace capitalism with something superior, they'll sort of have this full flowing sort of process, that they can lean on and rely on and draw on.
It certainly also sounds for an excellent topic or topics for future episodes of Pep Talk, for this podcast and other podcasts as well.
That's right. Those chapters, are those later chapters, which are the newer material, yes, I think we can take those in a different podcast.
Indeed. This has been Pep Talk, the Participatory Economy podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. In this episode, we've been discussing part of the book, A Participatory Economy by Robin Hahnel, who published the book, released in October 2022, published by AK Press. Ordering information is available on the AK Press website at akpress.org. To find out more about the model of a participatory economy, you can check out the book, and you can also visit the website of the Participatory Economy project that makes Pep Talk, the Participatory Economy podcast, at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can find an online forum where you can discuss the topics, this book and many other topics, or raise your own topic. There's also a regular newsletter that the group regularly sends out. You can sign up and share with others to learn more and to contribute. For Robin in Boston, this is Mitchell in Chicago. Thank you very much. See you next time. Goodbye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangements.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.